everybody. It's Owen from the Dodman Bandits. Our Tom Week continues today on Friday. We have Mr. Tom Rasch joining us. Tom has worked for Marvel on the 2099 runs of different books on that, but he's found his most success with his independent book. It is called Black Alpha, and it was a huge hit, and he's still doing more work for it. He's also worked in animation, music, all sorts of things. He's a very interesting guy, and I think you're really going to enjoy this interview. I know I certainly did. So here is Tom, artist and creator Tom Rasch. Tom, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the very, very beginning. How do you first discover comic books?
Well, I kind of, in a weird sort of way, did them in reverse, probably compared to a lot of children. I actually saw stuff on television first, um, especially characters, right? Like the classic comic book characters. It was the Adam West Batman,
Mhm.
the old Spider-Man, the jazzy themed Spider-Man cartoon, and then Star Trek with the three things that I remember of my first memories of television. So I was instantly hooked into these amazing looking worlds and
Mhm.
characters. And then my dad was stationed in Guam at the time. And then after we were there, we came back to the States, and my mom actually bought me my first comic book. And pretty sure at the time, considering when it was probably Neil Adams' Batman.
Okay.
But I was completely kind of thrown off because I didn't see Robin anywhere in the comic. The Batmobile didn't look quite the same, and Batman's cape looked like it was 30 feet long. But I loved it. And then not too long after that, my mom had two younger brothers that were teenagers at the time, and we'd go visit my grandparents' house, and they would pull their boxes of comic books from my grandparents' attic. So, so that was kind of like a whole other. The world was completely wide open because I got to see all these characters that I'd never heard of before, and they collected both Marvel and DC books, especially from the '70s. And so that was a huge part of like that. All these things to me are kind of mini milestones that changed my life, and I learned about the magic of comics through that. And then the other probably component would be when I was around third or fourth grade. They had these maybe you've seen them, these Marvel these cartoons that were made I think in the '60s, and what they did was they take Jack Kirby artwork
Mhm.
and they would animate like an arm or something moving. But at first I was kind of thrown off because I'm like, this is weird. But then I immediately got sucked in. So I was introduced at that point to Captain America, Iron Man, the Hulk, Submariner, Thor,
Mhm.
those kind of characters. So between that and then going through like my uncle's comic books, I got introduced to like Adam Warlock, Iron Fist, Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu, and that was it. I was just hooked into comics ever since. Still a love affair that I carry to this day. So,
And so how do you make the decision to pursue that as a career?
well, I think I probably have always been a bit of a dreamer, having a very overactive imagination, and so one of my earliest goals in life, I wanted to be a starship captain, being a huge Trekkie. And so when people would talk about like wanting to be a fireman or police officer, I'd say starship captain. Got laughter in my class. I didn't understand that. I'm like, I'm not kidding, you know. So I think my brain was always kind of wired, even my earliest memories of being like kindergarten, earliest grade school, to doing something fun and kind of larger than life. And then as I got to be a little bit older, and that was kind of the transition too. So besides being introduced to characters, I also started noticing artistic styles, and John Byrne was kind of my first rock star idol. And the books that he was on at the time, and this is before even he did his historical run on the X-Men with Chris Claremont, was Iron Fist and the Star Lord book. So I realized I'm like, oh, I really like the way this guy draws. And so I started following his work around. And then the X-Men was the first book that I started buying for myself, that I would ride on my bicycle to the local grocery store and start buying the X-Men once a month.
Mhm.
But I think during this time, I started paying attention to the people who were behind the things that I love, whether or not it was movies, TV shows, and comics. And so I had idols on a creative level, like the Gene Roddenberrys, the George Lucases, comic book writers and comic book artists. And I think probably around fifth or sixth grade, I was like, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do with my life. This is probably I found my purpose, which is, I guess, to belong to the faith of storytelling, right? So when I was in my mid-teens, I kind of started buying a comic magazine called Comic Scene. Probably a lot of people may not remember that one. Are you familiar with it at all?
I do remember seeing it on the shelves as a kid. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would buy those. Same thing. I could not, that's the thing that I loved about the excitement of that age, is that when you're a kid or a younger person, There's just this kind of excitement, like opening a Christmas present every time. I can't wait to get home, to open up this comic and start, diving into the story. Well, comic scene was like that for me, except it was stories about the comics industry. So I was immediately just completely immersed in like that industry and that world, and how do people do this? Um, how do these artists even get these positions? And so I started learning from those kind of articles and comic scene about like, if you want to try and do this, here's a few ways that you can do it. And in my case, I went the approach of going to comic conventions to try and show, portfolio and stuff like that. So, um, and I've learned through the years, there's a lot of naivete. I grew up in South Dakota, and there's a bit of that upper Midwestern naivete about, the reality of things, and then, the kind of the stars in your eyes kind of thing. And I kind of learned just how tough it was to get into comics. No different than any other creative field, right? As an actor or filmmaker, any of that stuff. Like, it's not just like, hey, here's my resume and do I got the job to get hired. So that's kind of been the blessing and the curse of all of it. Everything that I've wanted to do with my life is about the passion of storytelling in those platforms of the mediums. And so yeah, so I decided though, like, to go to my very first San Diego Comic Con, and I completely got ripped to shreds by Marvel and DC, which I needed to happen at the time. I didn't realize it, but I had to learn the mistake a lot of rookies do, where just because you draw fairly well, at least in the eyes of your friends and family, and you show up there to an actual publishing giant, they want the best. And so I walked away from that experience mainly with my tail between my legs. But I met an artist, Carl Kessel, who was inking John Byrne on Superman. And since I followed John Byrne around for years, I went from the X-Men to the Fantastic Four and then to his Superman run in the mid 80s. And Carl Kessel took a look at, I decided, so since I got turned down by every company there and thinking, okay, I must be delusional, I figured, well, the last day of the con, I'm going to walk around and see if I can check out some of my idols while they sit there and draw. Because, it's no different now. A lot of times you go to Artist Alley and artists that you're familiar with, that you follow in a book or whatever, they'll sit there and do sketches and do commissions. And so I walked up to him, and he happened to notice I had my portfolio with me. And he said, hey, do you mind if I take a look? And so I opened up my artwork, and he was very encouraging. He said, you've got a lot of good instincts about line work and rendering dialed in. He goes, so have you ever thought about becoming an inker? So he gave me some information, some editors from both Marvel and DC, and I sent away for samples. And so I got the samples back, and I did inking submissions. But the more I started going over those, I was going, I still really want to try and be a penciler. That's been my dream for years. And the one, and also, besides him giving me encouragement, giving me contact info, he sort of broke it down for me and said, well, because the weakest part of my very first submission I took to my first Comic Con was my storytelling was really weak. I was trying to be like the Watchmen or something without realizing the foundation of why the Watchmen works sequentially. And so he basically said, have 3 to 5 pages every page, have an establishing shot, have a close up, have a medium shot, move your camera around. And so I took his advice too and decided to take kind of what he said, because I figured, well, if I've got the rendering sort of dialed in already, and kind of the stylization of comic book art, the stuff I need to work on is what he mentioned, which is the storytelling is the most important part. So I took a few years off and worked on that. And then I went to my second San Diego Comic Con with 2 dear friends of mine, who both, by the way, also got their foot in the door eventually with Image Comics and DC. But we all went to our first con together. And so I decided to recreate the trajectory of what I did my first con solo. I went to Marvel and DC first. And the first things out of their mouth was, who are you working for? And so, but I made some rookie mistakes. I didn't have any samples of my work. I had my original pages in my portfolio book. I didn't make any Xeroxes, but they were trying to hook me up with a couple of editors. One of them was Casey Carlson, who was doing Legion of Superheroes. So that was a harsh lesson too, because, I didn't think about, well, geez, maybe I should run over to Kinko's or something and make copies, but I did make contacts, kept in touch with people. And so the very next time that I went back, I made sure I had Xeroxes this time. And so what ended up happening was I met another artist who was doing work with Malibu, and he introduced me to his editor, and his editor was interested in what I had. said he was going to reach out to me in a short amount of time to remember who I was. And so I gave it about a month and I reached out to him and I never heard back from that guy. It was probably about 3 or 4 months went by for the editor from Malibu. Interestingly enough, during this time, one of the guys that I went with, and we were roommates at the time, he decided for whatever odd reason to play a practical joke on me that he was pretending to be that editor that I was waiting a few months for. And I told him, I said, I'll wring your neck. I said, that was so mean.
Yeah.
I said, why would you do that? So not too long after that, I actually got a voicemail from Marvel Comics, from one of the editors there, introducing himself saying, you know, um, this is Matt Mora from Mighty Marvel Comics, and I'd like to talk to you about working for us. And so I had to double reference with my roommate and buddy again, going, did you do this the second time? I'm really going to strangle you this time. And he goes, no, I swear this wasn't me. So I called them back, and they actually had found, and I think at this point, could be wrong, but I think Marvel had bought out Malibu. So whatever I had left somehow made its way to somebody, my samples. And, they were going through it and basically picked me up. And of course I was, on cloud nine. I can't tell people, I can't really relay the emotional thrill of like something you've dreamt of for years since you were a kid, really, and sort of getting that call. And I've equated it to like if you're an actor and you get a call to, that the casting director has chosen you to be in a film or TV show. I said it's that intense. Um, but then there were always continued steps of learning that, and the book that they put me on was Punisher 2099,
Mm-hmm.
which quite honestly, I was very excited because, in fact, I just told a buddy this about a week or so ago. I said at the time, I wanted to find maybe a lower kind of profile title that I could really make my mark on, because a lot of the guys I grew up admiring had a book that isn't the book they made their name on, but it was an earlier book, and they were able to really kind of hone their skills, getting better at doing sequential storytelling, and kind of sort of taking that book and making it their own. I mean, I can name a number of artists that have done that through the years, even Dale Keown with Hulk. I don't know if you followed his work. I was a big fan of his. That's what I wanted the Punisher 2099 to be for me. And actually, in fact, I still have it. The Marvel editorial committee let me know that they were actually going to start me out at a higher rate than they would normally for pencilers, because I think they expected big things for me. Like hopefully I would become a fan favorite, and because my style was so strong back then. And at the time I was very much influenced by like Mike Golden and Arthur Adams and those guys. And I think that shone through in my work a little bit. The unfortunate part though for me is that I barely got my foot in the door, my big toe in the door, and then the market collapsed. That was when everything bottomed out, the speculator boom and all that. So the editor that I was working for at Marvel, he ended up getting let go, and so he called me to let me know he was being let go, but he was going to try and keep me busy working. And he ended up over at Harris Comics for a while, I think, working on Vampirella. And then the big editor that oversaw him, he ended up over at DC, and he worked on that Superman time. Remember when Superman like had a complete change in the way he looked?
Yeah.
The blue electric. I did a few samples for him and stuff, and of course he hates it when I bring that up now. He said that was the bane of his career, and he probably would have gotten lynched for doing that. But I said, it's the requirement of the company was to keep Superman relevant. I said, I didn't have a problem with that direction. So I sent him samples too. But I think some of the political stuff that goes on behind the scenes, like even if the editor likes you, there's a number of reasons why they can't keep you working. And then I was talking to other artists too that I was talking to when I'd go to, future cons in San Diego, when some guy would be like, yeah, I've been doing this for 2 years and I can't even find work right now. It's really hard for me to get a gig, So eventually, excuse me. So the two buddies that we all wanted to do comics together, at this point, they both actually got their foot in the door working in the video game industry. So they were like, come over here. They said the pay is way better. You have benefits, medical care, salary. And it took me a while to do that too, but I eventually ended up getting my foot in the door working as a concept artist in video games for a few titles. One of them was on the PlayStation Network and stuff like that. And so I had done that a number of years, but I'm a father now too, by the way. So I'm actually the dad of a 6-year-old, and that lifestyle of even working doing concept art it's a lot like anything. There's a lot of moving around. You kind of have to go where the next job or the next gig is at. So I did a lot of moving around to different states during that time. And so part of the reason that I don't currently do that full time is because of my child. So, I work in a basically different industry now, make regular income. But I decided about it a little over a decade ago because people ask if I was ever interested in maybe trying to return to that line of work, either doing concept art or comic books. And I was like, well, if I'm actually going to put in the time, because this was another thing I forgot to mention earlier. One of my passions too, when I was about 11, was not only I wanted to make films or I wanted to draw comic books, but I started coming up with my own storylines and characters. And the first one that I had, which was called Black Alpha, I created that as a fifth grader. And I was pretty much not even realizing it. I was inspired by what I was initially exposed to, which is superheroes and science fiction,
Mhm.
spaceships. Um, and that character was probably born of that young mind without even realizing it. So like my first major story that I was passionate about was a more of a space opera, hero's journey of the superhero myth. He's got a really cool spaceship. That's his Batmobile, Millennium Falcon Enterprise. That's his base of operations.
Mhm.
Um, and so I had a character I created then. I had another character that I created called Salem Tusk, which was a 16-year-old sophomore in high school. And I tell people because I was very shy back then. I didn't have a lot of friends. Um, I walked back and forth to school, and my brain was always just firing, like getting these ideas for characters would pop in my head, and instantly a story would build around them. And so they all stayed with me through the years. And back then, I think, and what anyone who follows your show, I don't know, like if they know some of the history of comics, but there was an early movement before Image blew up in the early 90s. There was a movement of creators that I followed that I was fans of, like Mike Grell with The Warlord, and he was doing a book called Star Slayer. Dave Stevens created The Rocketeer, during this time. So that was my first exposure to comic creators I admire doing their own material. And that was incredibly exciting for me because I wanted to see. Now, I think if I'm not mistaken, Mike Grell created The Warlord, but that was owned by DC, when he did that book. Whereas Star Lord was his thing, and then he did another book, John Sable Freelance.
Mhm.
Howard Chaykin had American Flag, so we have the Rocketeer. So that was my first, in my mid-teens, the excitement of seeing people bringing their own characters and universes to life, which I had already started doing myself. And then when Image blew up, about a decade later, in the early 90s, and I kind of saw the zenith of what that could become. That was kind of a philosophy that I still hold true to my heart to this day about learning to take the risk and kind of dive into the pool and create your own world and characters. And of course, the risk behind that is, you don't have any previous knowledge of exposure. It's not a household name yet. So you're sort of kind of venturing out into the unknown. Will anyone even be interested in this? Will there be, any kind of a following for it? But that was the risk I decided about, 10 years ago. Where I'm like, well, you know what? I'm going to go back and revisit. Well, I should say probably in the last 10 or 15, revisit these characters that I created as a kid and as in my teens and my 20s and go back and redo them and kind of give them like a polished update. So anyway, with all that being said, Black Alpha, since I've had it out in the public eye, it got optioned a few times for TV movie development. It was a featured comic, and also I had a section in USA Today about it. I had prototype merchandise that I had created, which was on episodes of The Big Bang Theory. And then also a few of my other characters have also had interest from Hollywood in
Mhm.
the last decade. None of that stuff was worked out until currently. And I think
Mhm.
that's what I messaged you about. I have a movie, a low budget sci-fi action movie based upon a character I created named Evelyn Levin that I started production this past year.
Awesome.
So that's currently in production. And so I actually have a small part in the movie.
Oh, there
I
you
get to do my glorified Stan Lee cameo in it. So still waiting to film that, but that should be fun.
go. Yeah, I
So
want to.
hopefully that wasn't too much information, by
No,
the
no,
way.
no.
Both one
Not,
question.
at least
So
I want to, talk about your creator own stuff, but just jumping back to when you were on Punisher, as a young artist, was the directive try to make it look like what the previous artist was doing to keep continuity, or do they say to you, have at it this, what put it in your style?
yeah, I guess my guess would be because that's kind of the era when hyper stylization was like kind of at its all-time appreciation. I mean, the image guys like Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, Mark Silvestri, like that was the age of the superstar artists. And a lot of that to me had to do with kind of their hyper stylized take. And I don't begrudge any, there's very solid draftsmen out there that, can draw to more, Neil Adams would be one kind of quasi-realistic style, but I think even me being into John Byrne, there was something a little different about his work, and I tended to follow the guys that have more of a stylistic take rather than a realistic take on. comic illustration. And so I that's kind of the direction I leaned, especially hard in my mid to late 20s, where I'm like, I'm really gonna just kind of go for the hyper stylized energy that I love so much as a fan.
Mhm.
And so I think that's what stood out in my samples that Marvel had.
Mhm.
And I know that one of the art directors, even Mark Chiarello, I think is how you pronounce his name. When I showed him my stuff too, he said you got kind of a real fun Art Adams thing going on there, and he had some critiques. But I think at the time they were probably just being like, well, hopefully this guy seems to have a style. It's kind of new, but it reminds me of so and so and so and so. We can kind of exploit or utilize that. So yeah, I wasn't given any directives. Now, to be fair, the era that the work I was doing was I was creating, it was very much of that image era. So there was a lot of the hyper detailed, horizontal lines that are supposed to represent gradient, values. Things were kind of hyper violent and bloody too. I've got one sequence where this guy's getting his arm cut off by some guy in a robot suit, and I've got blood flying everywhere. Because that was just kind of what the norm was. Even with Spawn being, where it was at.
Mhm.
Kind of gruesome, violent stuff. So I think that was just me kind of sort of fitting the time too and doing the kind of material. But never once did I get any feedback and like, well, you need to kind of dial back a number of things, proportions or the way, I more so you get feedback from the editors, like getting feedback about your storytelling, and back then, since that was a while ago, um, I would take typing paper to do my thumbnails and my breakdowns, even in stick figure form, and fax those off to the editor, and then he would give me his feedback, and then I was able to kind of go. And I know when I first started penciling the first initial pages, because back then, I don't know if it's still that way now, but Marvel would send you a FedEx box,
Mhm.
has all your paper in it that you're going to draw on. They send you materials, they send you copies of the comics for reference.
Mhm.
And I remember, getting that, I was shaking. I was so excited, but I was so nervous.
Yeah.
And so once I read the script, I had to go back and redraw it, the first few pages a few times, because I'm like, oh, this looks horrible. And so the editor would call and check and see how things were going. And I said, well, and he said, just have fun.
Mhm.
You don't have to be perfect. This is supposed to be fun. Try and relax. And that was the advice that I got, which was nice. And that's one thing I learned too, is that like most things in life, talent is only probably in a way maybe a third of the equation.
Mhm.
I think if you can be somebody that is good to work with, and your relationships with the people that are going to hire you is very important. If you come across very difficult or a prima donna, I mean, obviously you've killed your chances almost immediately. So I think that when people get comfortable to maybe sort of maybe kind of push their side of things a little bit, probably when they've had enough like power behind them because they've become a fan favorite or whatever.
Mhm.
But no matter what, I always want to be known as somebody that, even when I worked in video games, that this guy's a good guy to work with, because that's what I would want if I was in a position to hire people too. So
From where you were then to where you are now as an artist, are there certain projects you look at or things you've done as sort of evolutionary points for your art where you learned if I did this, this sort of looks better, and you started to see yourself change as an artist?
yeah, I'd say my whole history of what I've drawn and the stylistic changes I've gone through. There's some things that I miss that I don't do anymore,
Mhm.
and there's some things that I appreciate that. Well, probably my biggest one for me was I was very anal retentive about the tightness of the line work, and at times that could make my work and my figures look stiff. Once I got in video games, ironically, because I even had to be reminded by one of my dear friends who was the art director, that when I was designing these characters, and a lot of the games I worked on were like, World of Warcraft,
Mhm.
fantasy stuff. So I had a lot of creature assignments, and he would tell me, go crazy with the designs, because he said, you're kind of thinking of this like a comic book. You don't have to draw this character. You do a concept presentation piece, do some line work, do some roughs, do maybe a color pass edit, but like the modelers are going to take over once the design is approved. And he also told me, like, just loosen up. And so because of that, I was able to kind of capture more energy in my renderings because of being loose. I mean, it was so bad when I was younger. Like, I would redraw a face 3 to 5 times if the eyebrow looked off. That's how bad the OCD was with it, and it can slow you down as an artist, obviously.
Right.
So what I do appreciate as I've gotten older is that I've learned to loosen up on some things,
Mhm.
but there's also some elements where I'm going, yeah, whatever I was doing there decades ago, for whatever reason, I've lost some of that. So even if you kind of practice and try and feel like, well, I need to get some of that back, I do believe that, it's an organic thing, and it's part of there's a number of factors, even physiologically, mentally, about, you're supposed to grow as a human being. Well, I think you're supposed to grow as an artist too. You just don't want to peak as an artist or stagnate. But, so for me, like, I'll look at some things that I've done years ago where I'm like, oh, that's horrid. And other stuff where I'm going, that was pretty cool. It's pretty cool for my age or whatever. And then sometimes, and I don't get to draw quite as much as I used to. So you can lose a little bit of your edge too.
Mhm.
So I try and sneak in sketching when I can, but being a dad of a daughter, that changes the game up with what your free time is allowed, especially outside of your job. So, but I miss being able to draw more. But my daughter is the ultimate blessing. But from a personal level, for me, I do miss, because that's what a lot of people forget. It starts out as something fun. That's why you do it to begin with.
To where you are at this point, going back, could you have seen a career just in comics or just in video games? Or did you need to have both of them to get you to where you are today as an artist?
Well, yeah, kind of, I suppose, yeah, you could say a combination of the two, because, like, by the way, I don't play video games. I've
Right.
never played video games. In fact, when I go into a studio for an interview, we used to make a joke that because I don't play video games, and they would ask me what my favorite title was, I would go, "Wow!" And of course, they'd be like, "Oh, World of Warcraft," and I'm like, "Oh no, never played it." What always got me in the door was that I would be upfront with them about that, and of course, they would be a little confused, like, "What are you doing here?" But once I had a chance to explain, I said, "At the end of the day, the kid in me has never died."
Mhm.
And if you think about movies and comics and games, they all share one component, which is imagination. And the kid in me that enjoyed drawing monsters when I was 7 is the same kid in me that would enjoy drawing monsters in a comic book or designing monsters for this game. And so that's what got me the job every single time, is that they could feel kind of my childlike enthusiasm for what imagination is.
Mhm.
And I said, and if you think about it, all of these kind of disciplines and these platforms all have a commonality, which is you bring something to live out of nothingness, right? And so I said that's where the fun lies in it for me. So that's usually probably because of and I tell people repeatedly, comic book artists have never quite gotten their due, because if you think about it, you kind of have to do it all. You have to be an actor, you have to be a cinematographer, you have to be a fashion designer, you have to be an industrial designer. All of these things kind of encapsulated into one discipline. So to me, being a comic artist, like, you have to kind of really have all the foundations there. And so there's a lot of comic artists that also did the same thing. They transitioned into concept work, working in video games or movies or TV, because having that foundation of what comics require of you as an illustrator can be applicable to any of that kind of stuff. So um, and also, even with my characters that I've been, spend the last decade and a half developing, I've taken what I've done as my history as not only a comic book artist and creator, but also as a concept artist, and I've applied it to my own characters, spending enough time really developing the vibe of the world building, um, stylization of what the characters look like. The designs, to me, have to kind of be gone through an organic process of their own. Because I mean, a lot of times you don't arrive at a great design just right out of the gate. It's very rare. You have to spend a lot of time really massaging the image, as they used to call it,
Mhm.
doing the iterations to say, okay, we finally arrived at, I think this is going to work. And that includes all my designs for my characters, like the Black Alpha one that I mentioned, like, who he looked like when I was an 11-year-old is not the same what he looked like when I redesigned him as an adult.
Right.
Just the premise. I tell people his color scheme, name, and the premise of a space hero with a cool spaceship. That's the only thing that remained intact. So
I would say when you're creating these characters or putting them together from where you started to where you are now, where did you start? Was it with the appearance? Was it with their abilities, their name? How did you start to build these characters up and sort of flesh them out?
well, I can say with Black Alpha, the grade school design was I completely ripped off the classical X-Men costumes that were around in the 60s. It was like they had like a colored tunic with the underwear, buccaneer boots. All I did was I took like any of those, like, the original, like Cyclops and the Beast and all of them that had the basically the same uniformed
Mhm.
costume. I took that and I put kind of a bowling ball helmet on the character with these bug eyes, because I love the bug eyed characters, like, Spider-Man as being a big one, like in the 70s, a lot of characters had like the insect appearance or whatever, and Japanese superheroes for that matter too, like Ultraman and Inframan.
Mhm.
So as a kid, that spoke to me. So I had to make sure that his helmet kind of represented that influence. But from the neck on down, it's the X-Men costume to a T. The only thing I changed was that instead of blue, I think I had like gold or black or gray in it, right? But but the color scheme, it was black, gold, and yellow, or excuse me, yeah, black, gold, and white, and that's just what I doodled, and and I think I love that imagination of a kid where it's just so pure and innocent. Like, the adult mindset would be like, that's horrible, but the kid goes, you know what, I just made the most amazing thing ever. And I think, and the name Black Alpha probably came from, well, I watched Space in 1999 when I was a kid, and it was Moonbase Alpha. Um, Probably a little bit of Black Adam in there too, reading Shazam comics. The funny thing is, that was the name I came up with. It sounded superhero esque to me. As I got older, I've hated that name. I've hated it since. I could never come up with anything else though that made me happy. So as time has gone on, I've learned to accept it, because one of my buddies said, he goes, well, if you think about it, just take a name of characters we all grew up with, household names. He goes, and really think about it. He goes, like the name Batman. He goes, if you think about it, it's actually kind of dumb. He goes, Star Wars. He goes, we just get used to saying them. So he goes, it's probably going to be the same thing with Black Alpha. Once you say it enough, you get used to it. And so I'm not as embarrassed about it as I once was. I mean, because I've had to reference it so much and other people talk about it, I've
Mhm.
had to accept it. This is the name. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think even Salem Tusk, which is kind of my Doc Savage meets Indiana Jones. One time when I was walking to school as a teenager, I love Frank Frazetta and his paintings, and I had this random image pop in my head of this bald African American guy riding a woolly mammoth in the snow.
Mhm.
So with the woolly mammoth, Tusk, that's where I think that came from. But then Salem was, I like the Salem's Lot story from Stephen King, and then also I was a fan of the early '80s, another book called Saber,
Mhm.
which was kind of a black, kind of a swashbuckling hero. So I probably combined a bit of that imagery with a similar sounding name to Saber, Salem. And what I didn't realize at the time, and this has gone with most of my characters, I have what I call the phonetic hook, which is, what is it? I'm trying to remember the term. Is it alliterative? Like Peter Parker, Bruce Banner, Reed Richards.
Right.
There's something in the name that makes them easy to remember if there's a similar sounding letter,
Mhm.
or whatever it would be. So all my characters have, like, Black Alpha would be the AL sound.
Mhm.
Salem Tusk has a bit of the T and the S sound. I have another character named Damian Moon, the M and the N, those kinds of things. So most of my characters, whether or not it's subconscious, I've given them names that are just easier. Like Stan Lee said, it's easier to remember your characters' names if you give them something that they tie together, the first and the last name. Otherwise, he said, he would have been all over the place. The only exceptions to that would be for him, like Tony Stark,
Mhm.
you know. Bruce Wayne even is a little bit of that. Like, it's just, we're used to saying it, but Bruce Wayne doesn't have like even the Clark Kent where it's the K sound. So, so sometimes, yeah, the names would just kind of randomly pop in my head, so, and then they just stay, and I can't find anything cooler. So,
When you have an intellectual property like you have, and you said you've had negotiations with people to pick up projects and stuff like that, is there a little sense of nervousness that, okay, if this person picks up this project, are they going to follow my vision, or are they going to make changes to it that I might not be able to control?
I learned early on when this became a thing, because it started me getting my stuff option, and I use Facebook primarily to this day still. That's how you and I communicate.
Right.
I've always used it as a networking platform and to promote what I do. I don't invite controversy or drama on my page ever. In fact, I do my best to keep that off my page. Because I always knew, I said, if you want to share nerd stuff, this is a safe haven for that, an oasis. Um, and I'm a proud dad, so I share a lot of my daughter on there, and then share some of my history artistically. But I always used it to hopefully find new eyes to get on what I was doing. And so, because of stuff like social media, that's how I've even kind of come onto the radar of people out of Hollywood in these studios, big or small. But I learned early on, because I love Mike Mignola. I'm a huge Hellboy fan, and I've watched interviews with him. where he talked about like, and it's the best attitude to have, in my opinion. You always have your comic book version or your initial concept version of that character. And when somebody comes in, like a film studio or whatever, and they decide they're going to adapt the material, in essence, that becomes theirs because even though it might be based on your premise, if they're bringing resources to the table, whether or not it's financial, filmmakers, actors, etc., they get to call the shots with that version. Um, Actually, even Evelyn 11 right now, the movie I mentioned,
Mhm.
that's going to be a low budget. And I'm working very closely with the director on that. We've been working together now about a year. And he has got a lot of feedback from me and he's been very open. But ultimately, it's the script that he's written. And if it slightly has a different vision than what I've had in mind, I have to let it be what it is. I can't control that. If I'm not making the movie personally, I can't control that. And so I've told people, I said, yeah, if somebody takes your material and does something different with it, emotionally, you just have to let it go because that's that version. Like Mike Mignola says, I've always got my Hellboy comics. That's my version. The one in films, for a while was Guillermo del Toro, yeah, with
Mhm.
Ron Perlman, and then there's been a couple of other iterations of the Hellboy movies.
Mhm.
And I guess this latest one, according to Mike Mignola, was closest to his vision. Much smaller budgeted film. Ironically, I've heard people say they didn't care for that version. I think they're used to the Ron Perlman one that had a bigger budget behind it, kind of the flavor, the way that he was portrayed in those movies. Um, but yeah, anyway, so that's how I address it. And so I've also said repeatedly, if you wanted to get into business with a comic book creator, I'm your guy because I'm not married to the material that the other people want to make. Like if somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, we like this character in your book, but can she have purple hair instead of black?" There are creators out there, and that's fine with them if that's how I want to do it. But sometimes we'll blow a deal because they're so married to the material that after a while, the people who might want to partner up with them, that they won't relinquish control of another version of it. I'm the complete opposite, unless I've even had offers in the past to do alphas, black alphas in anime, which I would love. Stylistically, the story and the mythology lends itself to that kind of material anyway, because it's not really straight up superhero stuff. I said, as long as the tone of the story stays intact, that's all I care about. I don't even care if you swap genders of characters. I really don't. I said, if you can make that work, that's fine with me.
Mhm.
Um, but by the way, I forgot to mention that too. Like, with Black Alpha, because I get so excited. The 11-year-old in me comes out, so I get so excited because all these things have been in my head for so many years that I forget to give the information to somebody new or anybody, I guess, out in your audience. Black Alpha is what I've described as what if you took the Batman story, you sprinkled an Iron Man tech, and you dropped it off in the middle of a Star Wars like universe. Um, so it follows some of the superhero tropes, but I would call it more space opera than superhero. And I know that the premise is like it has some similarities to like the Nova Corps, the
Mhm.
Green Lanterns, because it's these organizations of basically these space cops. In my version, they're all slowly dying out, kind of like how the Jedi Knights were wiped out. Um, but it also separates itself from Green Lantern because my story is about one particular character that these factions of these space cops now have all been eradicated, and it's kind of an interesting hero's journey because he grows up as a young kid wanting to be their equivalent of a Green Lantern in my story, but from his childhood years until his teens, so much of his life just changed and completely just imploded. So he's become much more cynical compared to like the 6-year-old boy that he once was. And then by the time we get to his story, he's in his mid to late teens. And I want to tell a more of a character story. You know what I mean? Like taking the tropes of the superhero myth where the character has loss. And in this case, like my character's entire family's wiped out, not just a parent or parents, including a sibling. And I want to sort of have the reader feel like, how do we process such traumatic loss? How do we not in the end give up on ourselves? You know what I mean? And sometimes kind of the twisting road of what your goals were as a kid and the challenges you have in between, and then ultimately where you end up and you hopefully have some maturity on that hero's journey, that arc. That's what the emotional motif of Black Elf is all about. Is the characters, I want them to behave more grounded, more in a realistic sense of how they would deal with situations. Like I've even got a sequence because there's a lot of flashbacks in my story because I want the audience to become invested in all my characters, but the lead character, like his dad is taking him out for a drive in the spaceship. It would be like going out in the family car, when you're trying to learn how to drive the, you know what I mean? Like, so the character goes through those moments, even though it takes place in space, everything that he goes through as a character would be no different than somebody being raised here on Earth, and sometimes having tragedy that you're not counting on, right? And how you deal with that is very important, I think, and generally in life, with how we all deal with how our life doesn't always take us to the places that we anticipate when we're younger, and how we can rise above. And also the superhero myth I've always been intrigued by, because like if you look at the classic myths of both the heroes and the villains, they're both the heroes of their own story. And in a one case, the villain ends up going one direction that the hero also could have gone.
Right.
There's a number of reasons why he didn't go to that ultimate dark place and could have become a villain in his own right. So my character, through some of his story, through this flashbacks, he almost could have gone down that villainous role because he had such cynicism and anger and rage in his heart, but I want him to grow as a character from a young man in his teens until, ultimately the seasoned hero that'll be when he's maybe by the time he's in his 30s or whatever.
So with these characters, you have a starting point. Have you thought of an end point yet? Or do you just sort of see where things are going and where things grow organically and just keep growing and going with it?
I have kind of a rough overview in part because the way that I do my stories, by the way, so like Black Alpha is one issue into a 4-issue miniseries.
Right.
And each miniseries I treat as its own self-contained movie or novel.
Mhm.
So it's 4 acts instead of 3 for like a film, but it's 4 acts. And so each miniseries would wrap up with kind of a coda or an actual finale
Mhm.
that we can leave some subplots dangling in case we decide we want to do another one.
Mhm.
In an ideal world, if I had the time and the resources, there would probably be at least a few of these miniseries um, before you get to this lead character's kind of maybe the end point. But with that being said, like I built this IP. I tell people I'm very much inspired by what I grew up with. I wear my influences on my sleeve, and I just give it my fresh coat of paint. So what I've done is like with this particular one with Black Alpha, I've done the Star Trek, Star Wars, even Green Lantern, I guess in a sense. The universe is the star of the IP. It's not one single character. So I have other side stories I love to do. And by the way, this was a realization through a friend of mine that I came up with. Remember how I said I was embarrassed of the name Black
Right.
Alpha? And that's what I called him since I was a kid. But one of the things that I've done recently was to take that name and treat it like the Green Lanterns, right? Green Lantern title is
Mhm.
about one of the Green Lanterns. So I've decided in the story that there were these characters in ancient times that were the Black Alphas. They were these space cops, kind of this legendary royal guard that were almost treated like folk heroes, right? But in the current political climate, so much has changed. They tried to negate from that, and they're called just guardsmen now. Like each guardsman has a faction that they represent of 12 star systems.
Okay.
So I decided that I could do stories about future guardsmen characters,
Mhm.
past guardsmen characters, guardsmen factions, kind of
Mhm.
like what you do with the Jedi Knights, right?
Right.
So there's the possibility to do other stories, but this initial story based upon the lead character in the current version, like I do have a bit of a wrap up for his arc. You know, I'm hoping maybe because the publishers that I'm aligned with, WTF Comics,
Mhm.
even though they disagree with me on this, um, WTF does not stand for
Mhm.
what you think it stands for.
Right.
Now, lately, I've been hearing them say it stands for what the bleep, right?
Okay.
Um, I go with the original notion of what it's called, but they have expressed interest in maybe wanting to do another miniseries, like a spin-off of another character
Mhm.
in the current version. And I'm like, yeah, I would be open to that. It's just a matter of like, because it's taken me about 10 years to get this miniseries moving along again in the last few years, right? Um, that's the thing too. I tell people, when it comes to comic creation, because it's a lot more labor intensive than people realize. I said, Marvel and DC have had the financial means to pay their artists and their team to get the books out in a timely manner. But when you're an independent creator, Kickstarter does come in handy, the crowdfunders, but you're sort of having to kind of be relying on your schedule and what you're able to do. So for me personally, like before I aligned myself with WTF Comics, I was trying to do it all on my own. I just didn't have the time. I kept telling myself, in fact, I ended up having to pay an artist on the first book. Him and I both took pages, right? Um, but I never gave up on it. And the audience that has been following it for 10 years never gave up on it. So I feel like I owe it to them to at least see it through the 4 issues. that's going to be a big weight off my shoulders when it's done. We're just about wrapped up with issue 2 as we're getting ready to do another crowdfunder, more than likely by this late spring or summer.
Mhm.
And then we have, try and get to 3 and 4 done. And then that'll be the end of that miniseries. It won't be necessarily the end of that lead character story in that one, though. We're hoping to leave maybe a little bit of a mystery that'll want people, people want to see another one, kind of keep them like a movie, right? Like what Marvel did. The teases at the end to get the audience hyped to like, oh, maybe that's going to be in the next whatever this, and I've taken that same approach that we hope to keep the audience interested, I guess.
As an independent creator, how do you get your name out there? And what could be with Kickstarter now, with all these, different platforms, it's a very crowded market. There's stuff all over the place. How do you think is the best way to get your name out there that you found it to be?
Well, I definitely learned to utilize, like what do you call that when you're like, oh, name dropping?
Right.
I take my history as Marvel Comics, Big Bang Theory, USA Today, and also working for the PlayStation Network. Those are like buzz phrases that you get out there because people will, I think, on a subconscious level, will pick up on things that they've heard of, right? And they figure if you're somehow part of that, you must have quality in what you do, right? To be like a professional. So I try to utilize that, but honestly, I also just take the approaches that like what especially film studios have done to get eyes and ears on what they're doing. And so like in Black Alpha's case, I had a number of prototypes created, like little maquette statues of like a foot tall, action figures, T-shirts, models of the spaceship, like anything that I've seen the studios do when they're trying to hype a film to get through the white noise of getting things out there.
Mhm.
And so for me, between the combination of utilizing my history and some of the accomplishments I've had during that time, mixed in with like the potential of what it could look like in the movie space, not just the comic space, but the merchandising space. That's usually what has worked for me. And that's actually even what has brought in people from Hollywood to me, is that they'll see the approach I'm taking. And because of that, and then sometimes I've also been slightly criticized that I make things look a little too good. So people assume I've already got a number of things in place that I don't necessarily, right? Oh,
Right.
this guy already has a movie going on, whatever the case is.
Right.
Um, and I try and keep a pulse on the rhythm because the market is shifting so dramatically now too, right? And I mean it's a bit of a dichotomy because like we live in a very exciting age that if you're dying to tell a story, you have so many ways to get it out there. You don't need to wait for like a middleman or a gatekeeper to do it. But also because of that, there's much more people now that are rushing to get their content. So now you have all these things in front of you that are, vying for your attention. And so I just try and kind of stay with that. And I always try and learn something new, like what are people doing that maybe an approach I could also adopt. I mean, that's one thing I've done for years. I'm like, well, maybe I'll try this for a while. If this doesn't work, I'll try something else.
And the movie that is in production now that you're working on, how excited are you to have this sort of come to life and to see this vision sort of take a different form?
Oh, I mean, incredibly excited because it's one of the things I've wanted since I was a kid. Because some of my friends that have kind of given me feedback on my approach, and to me, you got to be honest with yourself. You got to do things your way, your path, right? I know some people out there that they want to just make a comic book, and I'm like, kudos to them. Since I was a young boy, because I was exposed to superheroes through television first, right? And then immediately I got hooked on the toys not too long after that. So for me, IP stuff is about like what I call a deep audience immersion investment, which is when things are so dear to you, the stories that you read or that you watch, I want to have everything to do with that world that I can tangibly hold in my hand. And whether or not it's phrases or symbols or all of it, right? So as a kid, I didn't just like the comics. I like the cartoons, the TV shows, the toys, the T-shirts, coffee mugs, cereal. I enjoy all of that. So my approach as an adult creator is I've taken that same approach, which is, I don't want this just to be a comic book. I've always wanted my stuff to be, a cartoon or a movie or whatever, and toy lines and games and everything. So that's been the goal that I've really been pushing hard now for a little over a decade. And I've had a few times like where things were going to happen and then they didn't happen. And that happened more than once. So, I'm a human being too. And I can go through those, like where you're kind of questioning, you got some self-doubt, imposter syndrome a little bit, like, okay, this hasn't worked out. maybe I'm living in my own little bubble, my own delusional bubble, right? And but I've kind of had to learn too through experience that a lot of things that we do see coming to light, um, ideally it would be nice if it happened in these one, two, three steps, but a lot of times it doesn't go that way. So like, as far as Black Alpha goes, it's been optioned three different times over the last decade. Nothing came out of that in the end. Um, Salem Tusk, a couple different times was supposed to be a low budget independent movie that fell apart too.
Mhm.
But with Evelyn 11, this has gotten farther than the previous ones. I actually just saw some test footage with VFX about a week or so ago from the director, and that was very exciting to see.
Mhm.
Um, and he actually did a couple of animation tests, a couple of my more kid centric IPs, and I think that he's implying maybe down the line we can partner up to do a bit of a kid style
Mhm.
with my other characters, right? Because one thing, by the way, I forgot to mention also, I was against this notion for years, but all of my characters, and there's about seven that I tend to have on the public eye, I figured out a way. It took me a while to get there, but they actually are part of a shared universe. So we're hoping in the comics and the movie there's going to be some Easter egg callouts, because I know the modern audience loves that stuff, connecting the dots. I think at the time I was very kind of like I felt like that stuff was overdone, when you do all the like the big event crossover with the books. But after thinking about it, I'm like, no, that would be cool. That even if the characters never show up in a book, there might be a reference, right? That one of the characters in the other books or a cultural event, they're like, oh, that has to do with that in the audience. And I think it keeps them more interested, quite honestly, when you do that now. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's still one of those like the kid in me will always be like, pinch me, you know. This is what I've always wanted because I mean, being a shy art nerd where I didn't have a lot of friends, I remember standing outside in recess in school as a sixth grader humming a potential theme to a Black Alpha cartoon. So that's how long this stuff, it never left. It always stayed with me, maybe foolishly at times, never
Mhm.
left me. But it's like I don't know anything else because I know a number of people out there who, if they have goals, I mean, even just simple goals in life, right? Like some people like, oh, I used to draw when I was a kid. I kind of broke away from that or for whatever reason. And ultimately, every character I've come up with, they're part of who I am emotionally. They live up here all the time. It's never like I lost interest in any of them. They're just there, sometimes fighting for their voices where I have to kind of tell them to quiet down because I have so many of them. And also, I have a number of them that aren't even in the public eye. I'd say altogether now, I probably have easily over 20 something IPs that I would love to do, not just as comics, some would be like YA, young adult fiction novels, or whatever the case is, whatever they seem to kind of fit. But yeah, so it's that can be a bit of my curse is also not having the time and figuring out which one of these I should nurture currently to get out in the public eye to get them, to finished product.
Could you see doing this full time? Like this is all you do?
Yeah, I mean that's been the goal for over a decade. It hasn't happened yet. I wanted to basically do like you'll see some filmmakers like J.J. Abrams, them doing the Star Trek movies and the other projects he's done. Of course, some of the Star Wars sequel films, but he has Bad Robot,
Mhm.
where some people have their like umbrella imprint that the whole imprint is set up to basically cultivate IP, right? So I have a dream that myself and some of my like-minded colleagues and friends that we could create a studio that we pay our bills by cultivating IP in all its various forms, right? Um, that's still the dream, honestly. Like I mean, I wouldn't, I shouldn't say unless I would know what it was like. But if all of a sudden I had a financial windfall of wealth, how would I deal with that? But ideally, I would like to just be able to comfortably keep a roof over my head, keep my daughter provided for, and be able to put food on the table. And if I could able to make a full time doing this, I would love that. I mean, some people do live that dream, right?
Yeah.
So that would be like the end goal in that end. But since that hasn't happened yet, I just continue because even when it comes to where I'm at, right now, my thing for the past 10 years is getting eyes on what I'm doing.
Mhm.
So even with the Evelyn 11 movie, it's a low budget project. I don't know if it's going to bring in money or not. It could, it may not, but I'm more excited about it, just people getting to see it. Even if it's more of a collaborative effort with a filmmaker kind of doing his take on the material.
Makes sense. It sounds like you have so many irons in the fire right now. How can fans follow you, see updates, as things progress?
Like I said, mainly I do Facebook. So it's under Tom, Tom, and then last name is spelled Rasch. And once again, that's Rasch because people want to do the Rash, the traditional spelling of like skin rash or diaper rash. But Yeah, it's Tom Rash, and I mainly promote on Facebook. I do have an Instagram page
Mhm.
that people can look for. I will have to admit I don't run that myself. Um, so one of my friends, Jack, over at WTF Comics, tends to run that stuff.
Okay.
Um, but I'd say, yeah, 98% of what I've done for the last decade is if anyone's interested in what I'm doing, I always tell people constantly to friend request me. I do that when I meet people at cons
Mhm.
because I'm a fan too. I love meeting people. I love being able to kind of really be a part of what I call my tribe, which is anyone who loves nerdy stuff. And I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, Star Wars, comic books. I love connecting with people because we're the same. You know what I mean? That passion is there. And I see it within them as I see it within myself. But yeah, if anyone's interested in what I'm doing, I mainly just go to, in fact, on Facebook the last 10 years, I made the announcement about Black Alpha being in USA Today, being on the Big Theory or Big Bang Theory, being optioned for TV stuff, cartoons or whatever. So I've been keeping people in the loop, and ultimately, I hope that's how I keep them interested in what I'm trying to do. Because I will say this again, I'll reiterate, I'm so grateful that people have not checked out on Black Alpha when they easily could have, because they're like, oh my God, when is this guy ever going to come out with the next issue? And so when I meet people at cons, when I do them, they'll still come up to me and what they have questions. I want to know when the next book is coming out. So I'm going to be eternally grateful for that, because I've said as a creator, as a creative spirit, especially, I think anybody can relate to this. Like, I don't care if it's poetry, a song you've written, there's a big risk. You feel, I mean, you emotionally, you feel naked
Mhm.
saying, this is what I do. It's brand new. I came up with it. And you hoping that you're not met with thunderous apathy,
Yeah.
a deadening applause of just nothingness, right? So it's always a win to me, like when people are interested in anything you're doing. And I'm hoping, that my influence is being like, if you grew up loving, in fact, we've done that with our previous Kickstarter with Black Alpha, like if you like this and this and this,
Mhm.
hopefully you'll like this. And because I mean, ultimately, what I would want as a creator is that the audience enjoys my stories the way I've enjoyed the stories I've grown up with, all of them, right? And there's a bit of a narrative passing the torch, which I think is highly important in this day and age, because I can go into a complete philosophical diatribe about storytelling is the one thing that has changed mankind since the beginning of time.
Mhm.
It's the communication and sharing of ideas, whether or not it's cultures springing up from nothingness, on an anthropological level, but also the cave drawings. You always hear that one being referenced. To me, comic entertainment, modern entertainment is like the myths of years past. We find a number of important things that help inspire us to do better, grow as a person, grow culturally, and so I very much am a deep believer in passing on what you've been giving. And if you're able to give people inspiration through the stories you create, that's a win in my opinion. That's really probably one of, besides being a good dad, that's the best legacy I hope to leave behind for people is Tom was a good person. And I saw this guy never give up on his dreams. I have dreams. I want to do, and I've even had people, and I'm always humbled by those comments going, I really look up to you for this or that, even though you feel like I'm not worthy of that either. But thank you. That's
Mhm.
my hope is in the end that at least a little bit of what I've done will create the next version of someone else that's like, I'm going to take a shot too. I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to get the story that I've been dying to tell for years. I'm going to get it out there.
And we're back. Yeah. Black Alpha, in fact, some of the merchandise from it, I think you mentioned there was featured in the Big Bang Theory. So that's actually pretty cool that it got picked up and used for that. Hopefully it gets used for other projects as well. I know he's talked about, with his IP. Folks have looked at it for cartoons and different stuff like that. So let's keep our fingers crossed that that actually happens. I think it'd be a really cool project. He's a great guy, and we're so glad he joined us, and we're so glad that you joined us too. We're coming close to a very big milestone as far as this podcast goes, as far as how we've grown, and we'll probably announce that when it happens, hopefully sooner than later. And we'll see you then. But have a wonderful weekend and take care.